Somewhere between a warehouse and your front door, there's a building most people never think about. It's smaller than a regional distribution center, closer to the city than a manufacturing plant, and built for one specific job: getting a package to you within hours, not days. This is last-mile logistics real estate, the final leg of the supply chain, and one of the fastest-growing categories in industrial property today. The term last mile refers to the final stage of a delivery journey, the movement of goods from a local distribution point to the end customer. It's the shortest leg of the trip geographically. It's also almost always the most expensive leg per mile because it involves individual stops, city traffic, and delivery windows measured in hours rather than days. Understanding why this final stretch matters requires understanding what came before it. A typical supply chain moves goods through several stages. A regional distribution center handling bulk inventory across a wide territory. Then a smaller local facility positioned close to dense population centers. And finally, the delivery vehicle that completes the trip to an individual address. Last-mile facilities occupy that second stage, the local layer, sitting between the big regional hub and the customer's doorstep. Physically, these buildings look different from a typical regional warehouse, where a regional distribution center might sit on 50 or more acres with room for hundreds of trailers. A last-mile facility is often built on 5 to 15 acres, sometimes smaller, because land close to dense population centers is expensive and limited. The buildings themselves tend to be smaller, too, commonly somewhere between 50,000 and 200,000 square feet, compared to the 300,000 to 1,000,000 square feet common at large regional hubs. What last-mile facilities lack in size, they make up for in a different specification entirely: parking capacity for delivery vans. A regional distribution center is built around trailer parking and dock doors. A last-mile facility often needs space for dozens, sometimes hundreds, of smaller delivery vehicles, a completely different site layout that older industrial buildings, designed decades ago around trailer logistics, frequently can't accommodate. This is one of the defining challenges of the category. There simply isn't enough existing building stock designed for this use. Most industrial buildings built before the rise of e-commerce were designed for manufacturing or bulk storage, not for parking 100 delivery vans and cycling them in and out multiple times a day. Location drives everything in this asset class, more so than almost any other segment of industrial real estate. A last-mile facility's entire value proposition depends on proximity to the population it serves. Being 5 miles from a customer instead of 25 miles isn't a minor difference. It can be the difference between a same-day delivery promise and a next-day one, which for many retailers and logistics operators is now a genuine competitive requirement rather than a bonus feature. This locational demand creates a specific kind of scarcity. Land suitable for last-mile development, zoned for industrial use, close to dense population centers, with reasonable road access, is limited by definition, because dense population centers are, almost by definition, already built up. There's very little vacant industrial land left inside most major metro cores. This pushes last-mile developers toward infill sites, older properties being redeveloped, underused retail sites being converted, or in some cases, multi-story industrial buildings, a format that's uncommon in most of the industrial market, but increasingly viable where land is scarce enough to justify building vertically. This scarcity shows up directly in rent and value. Last-mile industrial space in dense urban submarkets frequently commands rent 30 to 60% higher than comparable space in a market's outer suburban logistics corridors. As an illustrative example, if a typical regional distribution building 50 miles from a city center might lease around $6 per square foot annually, A well-located last-mile facility inside that same metro area might command $9 to $10 per square foot, sometimes more in especially constrained markets. Cap rates follow the same pattern, in reverse. Investors are often willing to accept a tighter cap rate for a well-located last-mile asset, sometimes half a percentage point to a full percentage point lower than a comparable regional distribution property, specifically because of that locational scarcity and the difficulty of ever replicating the site. Tenant demand for this asset class comes from a fairly specific set of users. Large e-commerce retailers and their fulfillment networks are the most visible tenants, but the category also includes regional and national parcel carriers, grocery delivery operators building out rapid delivery dark stores, and increasingly, third-party logistics companies operating on behalf of multiple retail clients from a single facility. This tenant mix creates a different risk profile than a typical regional distribution building. Many last-mile tenants operate on shorter lease terms than their regional hub counterparts, sometimes 3 to 7 years rather than 10 or more, partly because their own delivery networks are still evolving, and partly because intense competition for well-located last-mile space gives them less negotiating leverage to lock in long terms at favorable rates. Shorter lease terms mean more frequent releasing risk for the investor, but they're also somewhat offset by the strength of underlying demand. A well-located last-mile facility in a supply-constrained submarket typically releases quickly because so few comparable sites exist to compete with it. Development in this category comes with its own specific complications, beyond the land scarcity already mentioned. Zoning and community opposition are a bigger factor here than in most industrial development. A last-mile facility, by definition, sits closer to residential neighborhoods than a typical regional distribution center out on the edge of town. And that proximity often brings local opposition around truck traffic, noise, and neighborhood character, sometimes significant enough to add months or years to an entitlement timeline, or to kill a project outright. Construction costs can also run higher per square foot than a typical single-story regional warehouse, particularly for multi-story or structured parking projects, where the cost of building vertically, adding vehicle ramps, or reinforcing floors for delivery van traffic adds meaningfully to the base cost, sometimes 20 to 40% above a comparable single-story suburban facility. Despite these added costs and complications, investor appetite for last-mile industrial has grown substantially, driven by a structural shift in consumer expectations that shows no clear sign of reversing. E-commerce as a share of total retail sales has climbed steadily for over a decade, and every percentage point of that shift translates into more parcels that need a last-mile touchpoint, somewhere close to where people actually live. This has made last-mile industrial one of the more actively targeted subsegments within industrial real estate for institutional capital. Pension funds, real estate investment trusts, and private equity firms have all built dedicated strategies specifically around acquiring or developing this type of asset, often paying a premium valuation specifically for the locational scarcity that defines the category. That said, last-mile real estate isn't without risk, and it's worth being clear-eyed about where that risk sits. Tenant concentration can be significant, since many facilities serve a single major e-commerce or logistics tenant. Technology and operating models in this space are still evolving quickly. Automation, robotics, and delivery methods that don't yet exist commercially could eventually change what a last-mile facility needs to look like, the same way the rise of e-commerce itself reshaped industrial specifications over the past 2 decades. There's also a valuation risk worth naming directly. Because so much of this asset class's premium is tied to locational scarcity rather than physical building quality, a shift in where population growth occurs, or a change in delivery speed expectations could erode that premium in specific submarkets faster than it would for a more conventional regional distribution asset. For an investor evaluating this category, the analysis ultimately comes down to a few core questions that differ somewhat from a standard industrial underwriting exercise. How replicable is this exact location, realistically, given available land nearby? How many comparable facilities exist or could reasonably be built within the delivery radius this asset serves? And how dependent is the tenant's business model on speed to this specific population versus a slightly less convenient alternative location a few miles further out? A last-mile facility with a genuinely defensible location, dense population nearby, minimal competing sites, real barriers to new supply, behaves less like a typical industrial building and more like infill retail real estate, where location scarcity itself is a meaningful part of the value, not just the tenant's income. The last mile isn't the smallest part of the supply chain. It's often the most valuable part of the real estate behind it. Subscribing to the channel helps us keep making videos exactly like this one.